everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our final Ignite workshop of the fall 2022 semester. It feels weird saying that, but we are approaching the end of the semester already. My name is Amanda Golden. I'm the Assistant Director of the Herb Kelleher Entrepreneurship Center, where we promote the development of entrepreneurial skills and support the exploration of the ways those skills can be applied to careers as founders or innovators within established firms. Our Ignite Startup workshops provide an opportunity for students to learn more about different topics related to new venture creation. And these workshops host leaders from various industries and on-campus experts and enable students, faculty, staff, and the greater Austin entrepreneurial community to gain usable skills and insights for launching an idea into a startup or pursuing other career opportunities. Today, we're super excited to have with us Melissa Lee to provide an overview of the ways startups can prove early traction. Melissa is supercharging Dorm Room Fund's founder, investment partner, and alumni network. She brings her learnings from building connections at Harvard undergraduate capital partners, where she introduced new initiatives to accelerate startup growth and relationship building. Melissa also established a Power Hours program at Harvard Ventures to connect underserved, female-identifying student founders with entrepreneurs and residents, and sees endless opportunities to grow mentorship in the Dorm Room Fund community. Melissa will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So as you think of a question as she goes along, drop it in chat, raise your hand, feel free to ask those questions. We will also have time towards the end of the presentation for questions as well. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you, and I will let you take it from here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me, Amanda, and thank you for the lovely introduction. Hi, I'm Melissa. We're going to be chatting all things proving early traction today. Traction is one of those really gnarly questions, or it kind of feels like a vicious cycle where you need traction to go out there and fundraise, but it's also like when you have no money in the bank, it can also be really hard to prove traction. And so sometimes it's a matter of getting creative. And so today we'll mainly be covering your early hires, making use of your early adopters, and proving traction within sort of your go-to-market strategy. Before we dig in, I wanted to do a quick plug for Dorm Room Fund. I'm head of community and managing partner at Dorm Room Fund, which is a pre-seed fund focused on backing student-founded ventures, and we're sector agnostic, so we truly will look at almost any industry. For us, student-founded means that at least one of the co-founders or founding members on your team is either a current university student or recently graduated within the last 12 months. And so we're truly investing in students at all different levels and different degree types. So it really doesn't matter what course of study you're pursuing. For us, the whole thesis of backing student-founded ventures is that we think that there are really unique benefits that students have when founding ventures on campus. I think it's access to really unique campus networks, like professors that want to help you and advocates that want to advocate for you without any expectation of equity, which usually isn't really the case in the real world. Even with the kindest of angels, there's usually some sort of equity agreement. I think campuses are also this incredible time to launch products. I think we've seen a number of really, really exciting products sort of utilize campuses as their main launch strategy in the past couple of years. So think like Bumble launching on campuses through an ambassador program, think Cash App, the really buzzy sort of consumer fintech app, and then Snack Pass, which is actually a Dorm Room Fund portfolio company, also making campuses a big part of its launch strategy. And so we specifically invest in students because we're really, really bullish on campuses that have a connection to Gen Z or launching on campus. And then finally, we just love students. We think that students have this really awesome ability to kind of throw things at the wall and make them stick. And I think sometimes, working in corporate or working in a certain industry for 20 years can mean that you might be locked into certain patterns of thinking. Whereas I think with students, there's this really refreshing uniqueness to which you look at new problems and you come up with creative solutions. And so that's sort of a little bit about Dorm Room Fund and why we love students so much. A little about me. As head of community, I work one-on-one with all of our portfolio companies after investment, and I help them think about community building. So what does it mean to build a digital audience? What does it mean to leverage your super fans to become your brand's strongest advocates? What does it mean to really invest in organic growth? And so effectively, post-investment, we work with all of our portfolio companies to help them get to their next stage more confidently and more quickly. And so we have really awesome resources internally to do with hiring, for example, to do with, helping connect you with product and brand insights folks. And also finally, making introductions for fundraising when you go out and think about your seed round or your Series A, for example. We've been around since 2012. So part of the benefit of doing this for 10 years means that we now have student investment partners that have graduated and are now partners at some of the tier 1 funds across the country. So think, Andreessen Horowitz, think Sequoia, who can come in and invest at the later stages. And so it's an incredibly, incredibly powerful network. And we're truly founder friendly. We want to be there to support student founders. And so if ever you start to think about pre-seed funding, feel free to reach out to me. My email is just my first name, Melissa at dormroomfund.com. So super happy to meet with any of the folks here today. And of course, if you have questions about Dorm Room Fund, let me know. But let's talk all things traction. Traction can be a difficult question to think about, especially if you're not sure about fundraising. So it's kind of a question of working backwards, right? You kind of want to figure out what stage your company is at before working out what kind of traction or what kind of metrics you need to go out there and fundraise. So figured I'd spend a couple of minutes talking through the differences between pre-seed and seed stage fundraising. How do you know if you're truly ready to raise institutional capital? I really think of pre-seed as proof of concept. And so what this means is that you're sort of close to building out an MVP. You've done some level of product building to show for your concept. But your product isn't in market yet, or if it is, it's incredibly early. No one really expects it to be super polished. You have early testers who can prove that you've identified a clear market opportunity. So perhaps what this means is you've gone out and spoken to 200 customers as part of your initial customer discovery journey. Maybe you have a beta test of your app or your product, whatever it is that you're building. Maybe you have a loyal community of 40 folks who are in a Slack channel and they're testing your product and they're giving you feedback. At this stage, you want to have a core co-founder team. So think at least 2 founders, but you're looking to make some more crucial hires with this next stage of fundraising. When I think about a core co-founder team, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but what you really want is to have someone technical on your team because you want to show executional ability. It's okay if you as the CEO are not technical, we see that all the time, but you want to have at least a programmer or a dev on board because if you're building a tech product, at least that's kind of the essence of what it is that you're building, and investors want to see that because it's as much of an ideas bet as it is a people bet at pre-seed. And then you want to think about big expenses at pre-seed as tech maintenance costs and engineering chops, just because you're still in the early stages of refining your product. When we think about seed fundraising, on the other hand, we're thinking about proof of product market fit, meaning that your product is in market. We're looking for signs that the business will be long-lived, that you have revenue model figured out, that you're effectively good enough to get to a Series A, that your company is going to be your company is going to be around for long enough to weather challenges and storms. And so at this point, you want a finished MVP. You ideally have additional product updates. And I will say here that the ability to iterate quickly and release new versions of your product every couple of months is really important. Investors don't want to see a stagnant product where a product release takes close to a year, just because the expectation is that when you're in the early stages of company building, you're constantly learning. And so you want to be applying those learnings and deploying new products as quickly as possible at the seed stage. Ideally, you have a really robust early adopter base, or you have, users or audience, whatever customers, whatever it is that you're building. You have, a really robust number. So if we think about mobile apps, that might be thousands or tens of thousands, particularly if you go viral. If you're thinking e-commerce, you've proven that with at least a couple of your distribution strategies, you have really great folks that are engaging and biting. And we can talk what traction looks like across different spaces, because I know it definitely depends on where you're building. At seed stage, you want to have a more complete co-founding team. So you might have 2 or 3 engineers. You might have one person who's leading community or growth. You might have an operations generalist who kind of does everything. And then finally, you want to have some level of revenue, although I will say this depends. Like if you're building a consumer social app, typically you don't monetize till later on in your journey. Whereas with e-commerce, you want to have revenue out the gate. So it just depends on also like what industry you're building in, and investors understand this. And if you have any questions about pre-seed versus seed, just drop them in the chat and I'm happy to answer them as we go, because I recognize that I think the ins and outs of venture funding can be really complex. And then it also doesn't help that, you know, last year, like pre-seed rounds and seed stage rounds were the biggest that they've ever been. And then this year, obviously the fundraising climate is very different. And so I know it can be hard to keep up with. So just let me know if you have questions. The next part of early traction that I wanted to talk about would be making your early hires and how you think about team construction in the very early days. I think my big piece of advice here is that before you go out there and start hiring, you want to be really intentional about where you are missing skills on your team. So you can do a skills mapping exercise where you think really hard about, okay, like here are the people that are around me and are working on my passion. Like here are their superpowers. Like here's the one thing that they're singularly really, really good at, probably the best at. And so you want to then hire for people who don't fit that same skill set. I think sometimes it can be really easy to fall into the trap of recruiting people who are very similar to you, right? Because you get along really well, you have really great conversations, but when it comes to actually being heads down and building product and growing companies, you ideally want to have people around the table who think different to you and they have really different viewpoints on company growth, for example. You don't want to have people with homogenous backgrounds and skill sets. You also want to make use of advisors where possible. And I think advisors can be a really strong sign of, you know, you've been able to get really great people around you advocating for you. And I think this is especially if you're building in highly regulated industries that you might not know the ins and outs of as a student. So for example, if you're building in healthcare and you're navigating a really complicated payer or like insurance system, or if you're building in, you know, crypto, which has obviously gone through a ton of changes lately, you want to have advisors around you, ideally people who have been operators, people who've been leaders in the space, just so they can advise you, but also like it's great for signaling. It kind of de-risks your business a little bit as you start to think about fundraising. And then obviously advisors can be super great for strategic partnerships, fundraising, product. They can give you insider advice about the industry that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. My other piece of advice here that I think a lot of student teams fall trapped to, like, would be you don't want to over-index on business development, sales, and growth hires early on. I think it can be really tempting to hand this off because it's a lot to think about. But I am genuinely of the belief that CEOs should have expertise in this, or if you don't, you want to learn these skills. I think if you founded a business, you are probably the best advocate for it. Like, you can have your passion for the problem on full display. And I think marketing skills are just a good skill for anyone to learn, kind of being able to sell and tell a story around your business. And so you don't want to outsource these functions too early. You want to be the main advocate for your business, especially in the early stages. When you think about early hires, you really want to prioritize like iterating on the product and getting to launch, as opposed to hiring like a team of salespeople when you as the CEO should be fronting client calls and fronting new customer conversations as the face of your brand. And then I get a ton of questions all the time about, okay, I want a technical co-founder and I want to show executional ability, but how do I do it? Why do I do it? I mean, one, it's important to have a technical co-founder or a CTO rather than having someone fractional. So you don't want to hire a programmer, for example, who is being tasked with a ton of work, but isn't given the equity incentives to go all in. And so when you think about like the very, very early stages of a business, you want to have someone who's an equal partner on that company building journey with you, because it can be hugely, hugely stressful and a big time drain, and just it's challenging for anyone to build a business. And that's just me being really honest. And so you want to make sure that when you are finding engineers, you're giving them the appropriate space to grow as leaders. You know, they're either co-founders, they're CTOs, they're founding engineers. You also, what you don't want to do is you typically don't want to contract all the engineering work out to an agency. And I say that because agencies can be really expensive. Their iterations can be costly. They work slowly, and you don't really have full oversight of the products that are being built. And so sometimes I see like piecemeal products that are poorly built because you can kind of tell that it's been built in 3 different parts by 3 different people or agencies, and it just doesn't fit. Sometimes the code doesn't work. And then, you might think, well, why get a CTO when I can just manage a team of programmers? It can be really hard to do that if you're not tech fluent, right? It's like you want to set milestones, metrics, you want to set timelines, but if you're not fluent in this space, it's great to have a CTO whose role eventually moves to that of a manager. Like obviously your technical co-founder's first role is to work on the MVP and the first few iterations of your product, but eventually as you scale and as you raise venture money, your technical co-founder moves to more of a role of team building and managing engineers, which is also an incredibly important role. And the last thing I'd say on this part is I would really encourage you, when you're thinking about the technical co-founder search, you want to be really intentional around looking for people with expertise in the space you're building in. And so I say this because designing a patient platform as part of the health tech space can look really different from trying to design the next TikTok or trying to design the next Poshmark or an e-commerce platform. Like just the act of building that looks very different. Often engineers come with design skills or user experience skills. And so you want to make sure that you're recruiting for people that not only have the skills technically, but people who have some sort of context or background experience in the industry that you're building in. And then finally, my note on technical co-founders, like where do you look for them? I think alumni networks at your school is great. Hackathons and startup weekends in Texas can be really awesome. There's a number of really great industry specific conferences if you want to look for co-founders who also have a passion for your space. So the health conference in Las Vegas for health and Consensus for crypto are good examples. YC has a co-founder matching platform, and then obviously you can sort of lurk on the internet and reach out to people cold if you see what they're building. And then, a couple of pieces of advice for technical co-founders. We might be getting too in the weeds here, but if you have questions about this, like super happy to chat about this because it gets sort of nitty gritty. But essentially you want to pitch your technical co-founders. So when you reach out to them, you want to have a project pitch in mind. You want to be really clear on what your business milestones are, whether you intend on raising venture dollars, what stage of product you're at, like what your needs for an engineer are. So essentially you want to have a clear understanding of your intentions before you proceed with hiring. And then I'd also recommend, working on a trial basis to start with. Sorry, I realize I haven't been in full screen this whole time. You want to start working sort of on a trial basis. And so you might hire them as a part-time employee or a contractor to start with, just to evaluate the relationship. Or maybe you can like architect a small project together for class, for CS class, or you can deliver a low stakes project together first. And that way it's like you're just starting to understand this person's work style and their vision, or how committed are they to your business. And this is just a really great way to trial that. And then obviously we can talk about incentives if it's helpful. You want to give them equity in the early days when you can't pay them with cash. So think sweat equity. You also want to make sure that you're valuing them fairly when you give out equity. This is getting really in the weeds, but essentially when investors are about to cut a check, they'll look at something called the cap table, which is where they're figuring out like how much equity do you own in the business versus your co-founders. Now, if you have like 85% of the equity and your other 3 co-founders have 5% each, it's not really a great signal because it shows that you don't really value your co-founders or you don't really see their contributions as being as important, which aren't great for team dynamics. But I realize that we're getting in the weeds here. So if you have questions about this, let me know. But otherwise, we'll talk advisors super briefly. Why are advisors important? Advisors are really important because they help you with long-term strategic thinking, and they can act as really helpful leverage. And so not only do they remove short-term obstacles, but they help you sort of plan in a 3 to 5 year timeline, which feels like a really long time. But also when you're thinking about startups, like early stage startups, really do need to be thinking that far in advance, because you're eventually thinking about your exit. You're thinking about if you're trying to take this public, if you're trying to be privately acquired. You want to sort of have a vision or a roadmap for what the future of your business is going to look like. And so having advisors who've been there and done that can be incredibly helpful. And you don't necessarily need to have people like that on full time, but even like an hour or 2 of mentoring or advising a month can be incredibly helpful just for you to bounce ideas off them. And you want to look for domain experts. Obviously, domain experts can be really fluent in the industry that you're working in, but also company stage. So what I mean by this is if you're a pre-seed company, it might not be the most helpful to look for an advisor who has taken several companies public, because while that's helpful, generally it's probably not that helpful to your milestones, in the current moment. And so you maybe want to look for an advisor instead who has experience scaling a company from pre-seed to Series B or something. So you want to be cognizant of stage as well. And you want to look for advisors who've ideally been through critical or inflection points at other companies. Maybe they had to lay off hundreds of employees during COVID. Maybe they had to shut their operations during COVID. Maybe they had to make really difficult decisions, or they had to steer the company through periods of rapid change and growth. And it just depends on what it is that you're looking for and like what skills you're missing on the team. But you want to be really intentional when you look for advisors. Where do you find an advisor? They can start off as mentors who volunteer their time, and maybe you want to formalize that relationship with them because you really love them. Maybe it's a warm introduction through someone in your network. It could even be a professor at your school or a friend of a professor, or like someone who you meet at a fireside chat that you really vibe with. And so advisors can truly come from anywhere. And again, this last bit is like truly in the weeds, and it's probably not something we have to dwell on too much, but I will say that a trial period for advisors is also helpful. You want to set benchmarks up front for how you want the advisor to help you. So sort of like, time commitment per month, how you expect them to show up. And I say this because typically you compensate advisors with equity, so ownership in your business. And once you give someone ownership in your business, that's usually a long-term, well, it is a long-term decision. You're kind of locked into that. Granted, it's not a huge level of equity, and it's far less than what you'd pay your founding engineers. So for advisors, it's anywhere between 0.25% to 1%. But it's a long-term relationship, so you want to have a trial period first. I'm going to stop here before we move on to other parts of Traction, and just ask if you have any questions to do with hiring like your early team members, because I recognize it can be really hard as a solo founder, like not really knowing what to do next. It just becomes hard to scale if you don't have someone technical in your team. So I'm just going to stop if you have any questions. Okay, cool. So we're going to move on, but as always, just stop me if anything comes up later on. Cool. So let's talk proving traction as part of your story. So when you deliver a pitch before prospective investors, you want to make sure that traction as part of your pitch is sort of front and center. And there's a couple of different places that you can emphasize traction, and we can talk through these right now. The first one would be your problem or your pain point. And the place that you can demonstrate traction is if you've done a ton of customer discovery and maybe you've spoken to over 200 patients or 200 users, and you've collected firsthand data on, yes, it is a problem, or like X amount of people feel this way, or X amount of people believe this or have this same pain point. And so that traction can be either qualitative or quantitative in nature, but it's really helpful because it just shows that you're truly dedicated to solving the problem and you have a really thorough understanding of what it is that you're solving for. And it's important to show that you know what it is you're solving for, because it's about proving value early on in your pitch, proving that your product is solving a need that is legitimate. Sometimes what I see instead is students who jump in headfirst to building a business by starting with the solution, and they haven't done the necessary work around customer discovery. And so when they go backwards and try and find a problem to fit the solution, it ends up not working because there's always a disconnect between the problem and the solution, and it's never really clear why the solution has to exist. And when you're trying to build a business that is long-lived, you want to make sure that your business has to have a reason to exist. So an analogy that I like to use is your business should be an aspirin and not a vitamin, right? It needs to exist. It's not just a nice add-on, but it is essential because it is solving a really important problem. And so traction here just shows that you've done the necessary groundwork to continue building a business. Obviously, other things that you can mention could be secondary research. So you can use statistics to show the scale of the problem. You can use anecdotes that you collect from your customer discovery process. But I think, going out there, getting into the field and just collecting data is a really great first sign of traction in a pitch. The next thing I'd say is that you want to prove traction as part of your revenue model, or like your revenue slide. And the way that I like to think about this is that investors essentially like to see stickiness, or they like to see room for recurring consumption or revenue in your model. And so, you might be building a software business where it's a subscription model. So maybe it's freemium, maybe it's tiered. Maybe you're building in consumer fintech where you take transaction fees, or you take a revenue share as a percentage of each transaction. Maybe you're building an e-commerce where you have an entire product suite and your customers are going to come back time and time again because they are just that loyal to your product. But whatever it is, you want to show that you have thought really intentionally about this revenue model. Ideally, you have early revenue. Essentially, investors are looking for customer lifetime value, right? It's not just a one-time, one and done purchase. You want customers to be coming back. And so what you really want to emphasize is that with your product, customer purchasing behavior is replicable and it's repeatable. And so you want to get clear on like who's buying. If it's an ed tech product, is the principal buying? Is the school buying? Is the student paying? So who's the end buyer or payer? I think you want to get clear on that as well. And then we talked about team a little bit earlier, so we don't have to dig into that again. Obviously with product, if it's already built out, then that's really strong traction, and you want to highlight your product in your pitch by including screenshots, by including a walkthrough. You can do a live demo during your presentation. But just having some amount of product built out shows that it's a viable business and that your team has the executional ability to do what you said you were going to do. And so like what I don't like to see as an investor are teams that have done months and months of rigorous planning, and they've written like tons of business plans, but they haven't actually gone out to put that into action. And it just shows me that the team isn't going to work quickly enough in a fast changing market to keep up with the times. When we think about like venture scale businesses and startups, we typically are thinking about high growth tech enabled companies. And so if you're working in that space, it's really important to show that you can build product really quickly. You can release new iterations or versions of your product quickly. You can pivot based on feedback and what customers are saying. And then obviously, if you're not intending on going out and raising venture money, and if you're building more of a lifestyle business or an agency, or you're not building in tech, then I'd say product is slightly less important. So it just kind of depends on the space that you're building in. I'm not sure how many of you intend on thinking about being a venture-backed founder. And we can talk about this if that's a question you have, like, should I go out and raise venture dollars versus should I not? So let me know if that's a concern that you have. But here are some examples of key metrics and key signals. So when we think about, selling to consumers, you want to think about landing page signups. So if you're building an e-commerce, you can have pre-orders, for example. Like you might not have the product fully developed yet, but you have people that have gone on to your website, they've entered their email, they've signed up for updates, or they've pre-ordered. So, they want to be notified when your product is live and in the market. An email subscriber list can be really helpful, or social media metrics. Email and social media metrics are great because now, like in the time that we're living in, social commerce is a really big deal. So, essentially selling through Instagram or Facebook, selling through Shopify, for example. And so having a big social following is just kind of proxy for, you have a base of really engaged users who are there kind of waiting for your product, or who are there wanting to listen to your message. And then obviously having some sort of feedback from users on your product can be really helpful. And this can be quantitative or qualitative, and like social proof. So if people have been raving about your product on social media, you can ask them if you can use their screenshots of their feedback. People often leave reviews online. And if that's positive, you can definitely use that as part of traction. On the other hand, if you're thinking about B2B, so selling to, SMBs or big corporates, traction can look very different because it's a lot harder to win over a big company where there's a lot of decision makers, versus when you win over a consumer, like you only have to win over one person. And so there's not as much of a expectation around sort of high numbers when it comes to B2B, but essentially you want letters of intent from partners. So partners who say, like, I would love to use your product, like, let me know when it's live. So they have that in writing that they're interested. And that can be really helpful. You can visually show the number of conversations you have in the pipeline. So maybe you reached out to 100 companies ranging from SMBs to large corporates. Maybe 50 of them wanted to take a meeting with you. Maybe 25 of them wanted to see a demo live of your product. Maybe 15 of those people ended up taking it back to their tech teams and saying, hey, like, are we interested in using this product? And maybe you successfully closed 5 letters of intent. But just showing that pipeline visually and like the different levels of interest at each stage of the sales cycle can be really helpful at showing like how appealing your product is. When we think about consumer social, so, think apps like Clubhouse, TikTok, you want to think about repeat use. And so you want to think about daily active users, monthly active users. When you're building in software, churn rate is important. So how many people are canceling their subscriptions every month versus how many new subscribers are you getting? And a net promoter score is essentially just how willing you are to promote, or how willing a consumer is, I can't speak this morning, how willing a consumer is to promote your product to someone else, to a friend. And so that can often be really strong traction if you have that. And then finally, we touched on this earlier, but if you have advisors who are incredibly capable and really experienced and well-known in the industry, if they've signed on to formally working with your company, then that's really strong signaling, because it shows that you have the ability to attract the right experts and they've trusted you for a reason. And so if you can get the right people around you, like, even better. And I'm going to stop there before we jump into the last section of today's workshop, which is really leveraging your community and like the nitty-gritty of go-to-market. So I'm open to taking questions about any of what we just discussed. Feel free to unmute or drop your questions in the chat. All right, so we'll keep going then. But again, open to questions. I want to make sure that this is resonating. I realize that we're covering a ton of ground, and I'm not sure if all of this is directly relevant to you guys. So, you know, we can do live workshopping if you have questions. Like, we can sort of talk about it here. I think I see a question coming in, but I can't see my mouse. So someone is going to have to read that question out to me, if that's okay.
The question is, I think it means to be able to do these steps that you're talking about, is it necessary to be majoring in business, or, you know, can students from other majors, you know, what are some resources that students from other majors might access to help them learn some of these strategies that you're discussing?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. No, you definitely do not need to be a business major. I think being a business major can be somewhat helpful, because maybe you've done some of this marketing stuff in class. Maybe you know your way around a P&L statement, or I don't know, you know Excel, but I don't think it's that much of an inherent advantage. And I think a lot of these things can be self-taught. I think at the end of the day, if you have a passion for what it is that you're building, you're going to want to do the work to sort of go out there and learn those skills. And I think also a ton of this isn't necessarily, I think a ton of this is learned through experience and learning by doing. And so I think, you know, having the theory in class doesn't necessarily translate to being able to execute on those strategies as a business builder. And so I think it kind of levels the playing field, where all of you guys are presumably founders for the first time. You're learning as you go. And so I don't think there's nothing that can't be learned. The one thing I'd say that like you would want to like hire for, as opposed to learn yourself, would be programming and app development. I think if you don't have programming skills and you're a non-technical founder, like, I wouldn't learn programming from scratch. Like, I would definitely go out and recruit for someone who maybe is a CS student to come and help you as a co-founder. But I think all the rest, you know, marketing, learning how to be the best advocate for your business, learning how to talk to customers, learning about product development, I think all of that can be learned. And I think it's good to learn that stuff, right? Because you want to be the strongest advocate for what it is you're building. Like, if you're not passionate about the business, it's hard to get other people feeling excited. And so I strongly believe that, you know, learning skills like social selling, learning skills like social media marketing, learning skills like writing catchy taglines, I think are really important for everyone. Hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't.
I don't see anything else in the chat, so it looks like that.
Okay.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I truly mean it when, you know, like Dorm Room Fund invests in students of all majors and degree types and degree levels. So truly, like, when I look at our portfolio companies, we have freshmen founding companies and, you know, they're technical. we have law students, we have med school students, we have PhDs, we have folks that major in fashion or design. And so there's truly like no hard expectation as to what you study. I think truly the strongest founders often have really surprising backgrounds. And I have seen a type of founder profile where on first glance, it doesn't really make sense, as in, they're doing something really niche and their path of study doesn't really match up to it. But then you kind of dig into that founder's background and you realize that they've been thinking about solving that problem for years now. Like they've been mulling over that idea in the shower. They've been mulling over that idea, like, as they go through life. And so often like the best types of founders have like non-linear backgrounds. And I also think that there's something really powerful to be said about starting a startup on campus, because it's so like interdisciplinary, truly. Like if you are in corporate or you've been out of school for a number of years now, you tend to hang out with people that are really similar to you in their interests. You tend to hang out with folks that, did similar paths of study to you. If you're in corporate, you kind of hang out with people in your department. And I think school is just a really unique place to start thinking about building a business, because like you have exposure to so many different departments and schools at UT. Like it's actually wild how diverse the student body is. And so just having teams of like mixed majors can be really, really powerful, and far more powerful than having a team of like 3 MBAs who, I don't know, they all like supply chain, and there's sort of not a diversity of interests in that team. But yeah, that was a really awesome question. Cool. So let's talk about identifying your customers and your user personas and how you tap into your most engaged users for traction. I think there's a couple of ways that you can do this, and all of these, also double as traction. So there's a phenomenon that is pretty recent, and it's called building in public. And so that means the days of being really secretive about your business are kind of over. Building in public means that you have a really engaged audience who cares about your journey as a founder. And so you might use Twitter or you might use Medium to kind of share the day-to-day of what it is that you're building, the ins and outs of your decision making, your thoughts on product design. You're asking your audience for what they think about product, and so you're getting their input. And I think building in public is really great, because it means that you're effectively broadcasting to an audience that really cares about the success of your company. And I think it also grows your influence. And I think it just creates a bit of empathy as a company, right? You're not just a company, but you're a company fronted by someone who genuinely cares about solving whatever issue that you're solving for. And so that can be really powerful. Like I said earlier, I think campuses are an incredible way to build social proof and to sort of, act as a launch pad for growth. And so, we've seen a number of really successful companies launch on campuses, and campuses are really special because they're almost like this microcosm for broader consumer behaviors. Like, the hottest apps almost always take off in campuses. New fashion trends and music trends will start on campus first. On campuses, like everyone's a massive consumer of fast food, for example, if you're building in the food and beverage space. And so there's like a lot of power in relying on your peers to become really loyal advocates for what it is that you're building, not just because they love you, but because they want to support you. And, word of mouth is particularly strong on campus where there's a lot of social influence. I also want to highlight kind of like peer hosted events and community moderators. And what I mean by this is occasionally I see products that have been so well designed that they don't need customer service teams, because they have like users or community members who volunteer and want to do that, like want to take care of the customer service function. So for example, if you're building a mobile app, you might have folks that are so in love with what it is that you're building that they take to Reddit and they create a whole community talking about your product and advocating for you, or you have people like teaching others how to use it as sort of community leaders or product evangelists. And I think Notion is a really great example of this. If any of you have been using Notion as a note-taking tool for classes and stuff, like Notion has not done a ton of paid marketing. I think a lot of where its buzziness has come from is people literally on YouTube showing people how to set up a Notion page, or it's gone really viral on TikTok. And there are people who are not being paid a single dollar by Notion, who just love it so much that they're willing to create like group chats related to it or Reddit threads related to it. And so it's like, you want to have people around you that are just at that level of like wanting to stick their neck out for you, wanting to support you. The other way that you can build up hype is you can do exclusive releases or drops, or you can use a wait list. And I think scarcity mindset is a huge thing. And so think, like Clubhouse or a number of dating apps that have had really buzzy wait lists. And it's like, you need to receive an invite for a friend, and people were selling invites for hundreds of dollars on eBay. And so it's like scarcity mindset can be really helpful at building up hype. And then lastly, you want to look to social channels and social following as a distribution channel. And this is especially for products like e-commerce or creator tools or digital products where Instagram is like a proxy for your storefront. And the way that you want to figure out what social channels resonate the most is you can use paid ads strategically. I wouldn't rely on using paid ads for the long run just because it gets really costly really quickly, but I think it can be really helpful as an experiment. So maybe you want to give yourself 14 days to figure out if Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat is most helpful for you. And you can essentially pay for ads for those 2 weeks and target your demographic, your first tier demographic, and you can kind of see what sticks. You can compare engagement metrics across different platforms. You can modify the message that you're advertising with. You can modify the exact demographic that you're targeting. But that way you can kind of figure out what the most effective advertising strategy is using paid ads. And then you can stick to that, and it doesn't have to be paid for the long run. It's just a good experiment for you to test marketing strategies. Here's more, like we can talk about this if we want. I think we're getting a little in the weeds here, like funnel versus flywheel strategy. I think I see an extra question in the chat, but I can't open the chat, Amanda, so I'd love if you could read that out.
Yeah, so Shivam, if you're willing to clarify, in case I'm not framing your question correctly, do you think you're better off leaving campus while working on a non-social network or brand-focused venture? For example, a B2B where the customer base is completely off campus?
That's a great question. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. When you say leave campus, do you mean like take a leave of absence from school to build your startup, or do you mean marketing off campus?
Yeah, like a gap semester.
I think gap semesters can be somewhat helpful in that it's kind of a step away from campus, and you have the space and the mental energy to focus single-handedly on what it is that you're building. But I also think that there are really incredible network effects and resources that come on campus. I think like just being able to drop into office hours with your professor and talk about what it is that you're building, and they have no expectation of equity, I think that can be really powerful. And I think it depends on the product that it is that you're building, but I wouldn't completely discount campuses as a go-to-market strategy in that, sure, like the average university student might not be your end customer, but maybe you could run a pilot with your school's technology office, or maybe you want to license it to UT's English department or whatever it is. So it depends on if you're building an ed tech or not. I've seen I've seen people build enterprise products for financial aid officers. I've seen people build the next version of Canva for classroom management. And so I wouldn't entirely discount campuses. I also think that like campuses are a really unique place, not just for testing and launching products, but I just think exposure to new ideas and just kind of seeing what's up and coming. But we can talk about community building really briefly for enterprise companies. I think this is a great question because often I see folks mistake community building as something that has to be for consumer companies, when I actually think that you can have the same amount of like energy and enthusiasm for enterprise products. And so why don't I actually jump ahead to those slides? Yeah, cool. So sorry, I'm just finding my place. Yeah, so I've seen a couple of really successful enterprise companies also tap into the power of online communities. So ComSor is a really great example of this, and I really, really love what they've done. ComSor is effectively a sort of a customer management system, or sort of an analytics system for big companies to figure out, where their key advocates are, where their audiences are located. And on first glance, that sounds pretty boring. It's like there's a ton of companies doing that. Analytics is not an inherently sexy business. It's analytics. But what they've done that's really interesting is they realize that, yes, at the end of the day, they're selling to large enterprises, but they've gotten really clear on the decision makers in those big companies. And so they understand that the key decision makers who make the call of whether or not to subscribe to ComSor are probably the community managers or folks that are directly interacting with new members, like sort of membership coordinators, community managers. And so while they're an enterprise solution, they've built out a really awesome online community called the Community School, or the C School. And it's effectively a combination of a forum for community managers to ask questions. They run a ton of events for community managers. And what's interesting is a number of these events are actually moderated by, I realize I'm saying community a lot, but a number of these events are actually peer moderated, meaning that it's not ComSor having to put money and resources into running events. It's actually like the community managers within that community. Sorry, I can't stop saying community. The community managers within that community who just want to be advocates. Like for them, it's like, for them, it's something that they can lead with on their LinkedIn profile to say that they're community warriors and the community school. But it's just this like dedicated space where ComSor can market without overtly marketing its product. I think sometimes enterprise marketing goes wrong where it's really in your face and it's really salesy. It's like, buy my product. Whereas with a community approach, it's like you can define yourself as, hey, I'm a company that first and foremost cares about delivering value. And I want to do all these things for customers for free before even knowing whether they'll purchase my product or not. Like in the community school, ComSor never does a clear sell. They're never like, hey, you got to buy my product to join my community. ComSor says like, hey, I want to deliver value to you first and foremost. And I'm kind of the platform upon which you're meeting new friends. And so and then eventually the conversation in these forums kind of moves towards ComSor. So it's like marketing, but with a long-term view and with a focus on building relationships and delivering value rather than selling upfront. And we can talk about consumer really quickly for folks in the audience who are thinking about that. Product-led growth is a big thing. So building inherently social features into your product. So think like group shopping, where if you want a discount applied to your checkout, you have to share the link with three friends, and it means that you're growing at a multiple of 3. Maybe it's a peer-to-peer fashion resale platform where there's a social feed where you're encouraged to share pictures of your outfits. Maybe it's a music app where to stream, you have to stream as a group. And so it's like building in inherently social features that unlock more functionality within the platform. And it's just about, getting folks onto the platform and making a lot of these activities social. But I'm going to stop there because I realized that we're at time. And I realized this was a ton of content. We covered a ton of ground. I'm super happy to chat about any of this if you want. My email's just Melissa, my first name, at dormroomfund.com. And so happy to take this conversation offline. But Amanda, I'll hand it back to you. Sorry, I had sort of overplanned on the content side of things.
No, Melissa, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of our attendees. I think this was really helpful and everyone learned a lot. So thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for attending, and we will be providing the video afterwards. So if you want to go back and re-watch anything that Melissa talked about today, you are welcome to do so. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the semester, and good luck getting to the end of classes.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me, Amanda, and thanks everyone for being really thoughtful with your questions.